Yeah, okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and all the learners also. I think you can start putting of your questions in the chat box, or I think there are no much participants right now, so I think you can unmute your and whoever has the questions, I think you can speak out your questions.
I think Govind has a question in the chat box, um,
Yes.
which
Uh,
is how are the populations of migratory birds or those that are nomadic assessed? Um, so birds that are migratory, they will have summer home ranges and winter home ranges, and so they will have summer population densities and winter population densities, right? And so you can, depending on the kind of species that you're talking about, you could. So, for example, if you're trying to count the number of warblers on their summer home ranges and on their winter home ranges, then you could use something like, because warblers are vocal during the breeding season and territorial, you could use something like spot mapping. You could even use line transects or point counts to estimate population sizes in summer and winter. If it comes to waterfowl, like ducks and geese, which are in habitats that have high visibility, right? They're in the water, on the water with high visibility, you can estimate populations using census methods like total counts. Um, Nomadic birds. Could you explain what you mean by nomadic? Because most birds will will have territories. Um, Whereas you do have species like which are open ocean, like albatrosses and birds like that, that will have very large foraging ranges. They will range very widely. Um, so, but these birds, even these open ocean pelagic birds, do come back to land to breed, and so you can use total counts when they come back to these islands to breed. Um, Terrestrial birds generally don't seem to be very nomadic. They can have large home ranges, but they will not. They're not likely to, move at random in the landscape. Um, Sachin's question is: how is the census done in a specific area?
Sir,
And how, go with yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, sir, but I didn't quite clearly hear you mention the first part. My network was a bit off. Could you please repeat it?
Oh, yes, sure. So I was saying that the migratory species, depending on what kinds of species you're dealing with, you can use different methods to estimate population sizes. So, for example, if you're dealing with populations of warblers that summer they breed in some location and they winter in another location, and they're vocal in summer, then you can use even questions like spot mapping, techniques like spot mapping, line transits, point counts to estimate those populations. There are other migratory species like waterfowl, right, ducks and geese, that inhabit open habitats, which are high visibility habitats, and you can see them easily. And in those cases, you can use total counts to get at population sizes of those species. Um, how is the census done in a specific area, and how are overlaps avoided when there are multiple observers? Yeah.
Umesh, I
Yes.
think you'll be teaching census methods next week in next week's lectures.
Oh, that's next week's session, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
census and sampling will come up in next
yeah,
week's session. Right?
yeah.
So there's an entire session devoted only to that. So how
Okay.
do we estimate population sizes of birds? Uh, so I think Sachin, if we can take that question next time, if
No,
you
no
don't mind.
issues. No issues. I thought it was related to the population thing, so that's why I posted that. No issues.
Sure, sure. Got it. So that was population ecology. We'll do one on population estimation as well. Um, Sunanda has a question. Would the explanation of greater the number of birds, greater the number of species be valid for habitats with human interference with external feeding or through tree plantation? So actually, one of the people who has shown that the greater the number of individuals in a habitat, the more the number of species is Mousumi from her work in the Western Himalayas, and that was natural habitats. Um, Now, again, we will be talking about conservation biology when it comes to birds, especially. And what Sunanda is referring to is called land use change, which is basically you've got natural habitats that are being converted to, for example, agriculture or tree plantations. Um, Now, uh, so what happens typically when you drastically convert, let's say, forest to agriculture, is that you often lose a lot of species. Um, So when you've got, so for instance, think about urbanization, and you've got a very few species in urban habitats, right? But you've got a large number of individuals, and those individuals are represented by very few species. So what happens is that you're moving from what's called a more even community where you've got, and we'll talk about evenness and diversity when we do the census and sampling methods as well. But you're moving from what's called an even community where you've got a large number of species in the natural habitats, and you shift to a very uneven community in for example, urban areas where, for instance, most of the bird community might be, most of the individuals in the urban area might be represented by pigeons, right? And so then in urban areas, I guess it's not necessarily true that the greater the number of individuals, the greater the number of species, and that is probably because of a reduction in the number of niches. So you've got a certain number of niche, you've got a large number of niches that can be filled and occupied in natural habitats like forests, whereas you're reducing the number of niches in urban habitats and agriculture, and the reduction in niches selects for certain species that can adapt to these altered habitats. Can the mid-domain effect in mountains be applied similarly to the latitudinal range? Like if we randomly place points across latitudinal range, the peak will come at the equator. Um, so people have used the mid-domain effect to talk about latitudinal ranges, and yes, the peak will come at the equator. But think about if you've got a mountain, right? Now that is a bounded domain. It's bound by the base of the mountain and the summit of the mountain. Now, the ranges of species of in the mountain, the elevational ranges of species are one-dimensional, right? You've got lower limit of the elevational range, higher limit of the elevational range, and then when you pack those elevational ranges of different sizes at different locations at random, then it turns out that you get the highest species richness at mid elevations. Now, species ranges on the surface of the Earth are not one-dimensional anymore; they're two-dimensional. Right? You've got a range that has a latitudinal extent and a longitudinal extent. Sorry, latitudinal extent and a longitudinal extent. And when you add ranges of different sizes onto the surface of the Earth, um, you do get um, you do get a mid-elevational, sorry, uh, a peak at the latitude uh, of zero at the equator. You do get a peak at the equator. But that is because if you look at the area around you, say you take the area of the earth between 0 degrees to 10 degrees, right? North and south. So the area there is very high. Now, as you move to greater and greater towards the poles, the area between 10 degrees and 20 degrees is lower than the area between 0 degrees and 10 degrees. The area between 20 degrees and 30 degrees north is further smaller than the area here. So as you go away from the equator, the area of the earth is also reducing. So the mid-domain effect in this case is not arising from the process that generates the mid-domain effect in mountains. The mid-domain effect here is arising from the fact that area is high near the tropics, and therefore, if you throw two-dimensional species ranges at random, they're more likely to cluster towards the tropics than they are to be towards the poles, just because the area is higher in the tropics. To just again illustrate that with this, I mean, if you look at a cricket ball and you've got the tropics there, the area here is greater than the area here, right? And then when you get to the top, there's hardly any area. Yeah. So basically, you have more from this throwing ranges at random on this ball on the earth. You're going to get more ranges in this location, and therefore higher species which is there, and lower species which is as you move up.
Hi, Umesh. Hi, Umesh and Mosmi. I think so far, no new questions. I think you guys can like kind of ask questions to the learner so that kind of become interactive. If that's okay with you guys.
Yeah.
Yes, Mark.
Or Mark.
I'm sorry, I joined a little late. I didn't know it was all open for Q&A. So I just wanted to ask if we kind of observe birds arriving in very short windows in the same periods, year on year. Let's say it's within the same first week of June. every year, how do we kind of take this kind of information, and how do we kind of publish and publish a study that is useful, and what do we do with this kind of information when we find that there's a lot of specificity in the arrivals and departures of birds, and the locations that they come to, the kind of ecological habitats that they keep revisiting. um, what do we do with this kind of information? How do we take this knowledge and expand it even more?
I think the easiest way to include this kind of information and contribute this kind of information is to use some of these citizen science platforms that we have, like eBird, where you can record this information, and it will be picked up in the analysis that is done, where they look at arrival dates of birds in different parts of the country. If you I don't know if you're familiar with eBird, but especially for migratory birds, common migratory birds and all, they do annual analysis where they look at if the how they're arriving in different parts of the country. And these kind of observations coming from a site, even from a single site, helps us arrive at those visualizations and synthesis that we produce. So that's the easiest way to contribute this kind of information. Of course, if you want to do your own research, I think the first step would be to come up with a broader research question. What are you trying to look at? Like, are you trying to see whether the arrival corresponds with some changes that are happening in the environment? Like, for instance, like, is it coinciding with arrival of rainfall, the rainy season, the beginning of the rainy season, or the dry season, or some things? So you should have like a little broader question, um, within which you want to look at arrival of a certain specific species. Yeah. So that's the first thing. So you have to do a little bit more thinking and reading to come up with that meaningful question, and then you can proceed with designing a appropriate method to capture that. Umesh, would you like to add something here?
Yeah, just before you do add, I can just add a few
Yeah, yeah.
thoughts.
Sure, sure.
The goal is to do a research, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, the question has not arrived before the observations have been made. Like, it was not known, I did not know that these kind of observations would be found. It is only
Okay.
later on in the field that periodically I have made these kind of observations, and in the first instance, you don't know that it's going to occur the second time and the third time.
All right.
Now that you find an observation,
Yeah.
now so you don't have the luxury of going back to form the question and then find the findings having proved your hypothesis. So now what do you do with that information?
Then yeah,
If
yeah,
it
So,
yeah,
makes sense, if
so
my question is making
yeah,
sense
yeah.
to you.
no,
Sure.
Moshmi, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. No, no, Umesh, please, please, please. Carry on.
Oh, sure, okay. No, I first of all, I completely agree with Moshmi in that if you're doing a research project, then the data that you collect has to be tailored to the question. Because how you go about answering a question will determine your study design and will determine how the kind of data that you're going to collect. So typically what you do is you have a question that generates certain hypotheses, and you go out and collect data that you can confront those hypotheses with. You can test your hypotheses using data. Now, observational data before a question has arisen is more useful as a hypothesis generating uh, uh, tool, right? You make so every hypothesis begins with an observation. So you make an observation in the field, and you know you say, oh, these birds are arriving earlier and earlier in June for the last over the last 10 years, and then you have to come up with a possible explanation for why that's happening, and then collect data that uh, is capable of answering that hypothesis, capable of answering that question. Now, it might turn out that your observational data itself is good enough to answer that question. But you can't go from data to, as in, it's dangerous and it's not sound scientific practice to use data that have not been collected for a particular purpose to then answer questions that have arisen post hoc after the collection of the data. I The best practice is you make observations like you have and come up with a hypothesis, and then for why you're seeing what you're seeing, and then either collect new data, or if the data itself are suitable to answer that, then you can use that. So for, like Mousumi was pointing out, eBird, for instance, um, are data that are collected by multiple observers from all over the world, and then come out of this common platform from where you can download the data and analyze it. And a lot of questions can be answered using eBird data. Are arrival timings becoming advancing because of climate change? Are species shifting their elevational ranges upwards because of climate change? So those questions you can answer with eBird data. But there's a number of questions that you can't answer with eBird data. Right? Are the survival rates of species changing over time? You have to collect primary data for that. Now, again, with the data that you have collected, Mark, there will be certain questions that you can answer with those data. But there will be a number of questions that you cannot answer with those data, and that's true for all data sets, right? There will be a large number of questions that you will not be able to answer from the data that you gather.
That does answer a lot of my questions. Thank you. Another aspect now, supposing you want to really detail your study onto at individual level, and you want to say a lot more about this individual based on the observations that you have made, and you are theoretically convinced that this bird that you are observing year on year is the same individual, but you can't really say that, because how do you ID that bird? So in India, how does one get permission? Who do you get permission from? How do you apply for it? How do you structure a study that will give us some results and some understanding of individual migration of birds, and also pinpoint to the value, ecological value of those locations that it's in?
I think I'll take this one, Moshmi.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
So, I've been this is work that I do is on individually marked birds, and so like you're saying, you go out into the wild and you look at birds, and you don't know if you're seeing the same individual multiple times or you're seeing multiple individuals. So the standard way across the world to mark, especially forest small passerine birds, is bird ringing, and that involves the capture of birds in what's called a mist net, and you extract the bird from a mist net and you put a numbered aluminium ring on the leg of the bird, and you release the bird is released back into the habitat. Um, Now, if you don't want to recapture the bird to get its identity, right, you can also place combinations of colorings on the leg of the bird. Now, these techniques don't harm these birds in any way. Uh, and so, for example, I can capture a bird, and then I can place blue and black or red and green, different color combinations for different individuals, and then I can go out into the wild and observe and see, where am I seeing this bird, multiple times, and maybe get at its home range from techniques like that. To do this, you need permission from the forest department. So I work in Arunachal Pradesh. I apply to the Arunachal Pradesh Forest Department with a proposal. I say, here is my question. Here is how I plan to answer that question. Uh, and these are protocols that I plan to use in the field. And I am requesting permission to conduct this research. Now, the permission is granted under the provisions of the Wildlife Protection Act. So, if I am studying species that are very common and on Schedule 2 of the Wildlife Protection Act, for example, these are species that have lower conservation priority in India because they're on Schedule 2, then the state government can give me permission directly to study these species. If species are on Schedule 1, they're considered rare or they're traded, or for some reason they're of higher conservation concern, then often what happens is that the state government refers the application to the central government, and the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change at the center has to approve that application. So it depends on which bird you're studying, which species you're studying. the permission can come either from the state forest department or it comes from the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mousumi?
Uh, I would just like to add one thing here that you were talking about, working with a single individual. So, most ecological studies, we even like people granting permissions to ring and all, would expect like a much larger study where you define that why, the reason behind the need for misnetting and capturing birds and tagging them and all that. So it's unlikely that anyone will give you permission to tag one bird. So, and also what especially in the ecological or behavioral sense, what observations you'll get out of a single individual is just going to be natural history observation. It is not going to be it's difficult to make it into a meaningful larger study. Yeah.
Right. That's true, but if you're in central India, there are some birds from the foothills that do not arrive in large numbers. There are very scarce sightings, very sporadic sightings. But some of those sporadic sightings happens very with a great sense of regularity at the same locations.
Mm.
So it's not like these individuals that come in very small populations, very small numbers,
Yeah.
are it's not like there is not a population that's coming. These are just one-off vagrant sightings or incidental sightings. That's not the case, because they happen with a sense of regularity to it. So,
Sure,
but I
sure.
do get your points in terms, most tagging is done with waders and other birds where there are large flocks, and the probability of coming across those individuals is also higher because
Yeah, no,
large
but no, it's not
individuals.
to do with the population size also. It's like to do with the question. So, for instance, like anybody granting your research permit would want to know what information you are generating out of it. So, for instance, they would be expecting you to tell them something about the population, how that population is faring in a certain site and all. And that kind of information typically can't be generated from a single individual. That's
Right.
what I was trying to get at. Yeah.
Yeah, Moshami, if I can just add, the problem of studying rare animals is a real problem. Um, for us to make meaningful scientific inferences about how a population is behaving, you need to know, you need to have information from multiple individuals. And for instance, in our study side, even after 10 years of doing this work, we're able to analyze. We've got 450 breeding species in our study site. But even after 10 years of work, 12 years of work, we're able to meaningfully analyze only 20 or 25 species. So there's a large number of rare species that, because we have only one or two individuals, we can't do anything with that information. So it is a real problem studying rare species. And often, if you're studying great Indian bustard, for example, which is a rare species, you would often use people often use techniques that provide a lot of information from a single individual. Um, so things like radio tagging and telemetry. But that again, you can't just do with one individual and say and generalize to the rest of the population. You have to have multiple individuals, and if your species is rare, often you can't do anything about this problem.
Yeah, just to another follow-up question from what Umesh had answered previously. He said that he writes to the Arunachal Pradesh Forest Department. Now, let's say you're based in Tawang and you're conducting a research over there. You listed the protocol. You also listed down what are the going to be what are you going to do with these findings? What is it going to reveal? How is your understanding going to change? Who exactly are you writing to? Are you writing to the DFO of Tawang, the divisional forest officer? Are you writing to the principal chief conservator of forest? Who are you? What do you mean when you say you're writing to the Arunachal Pradesh Forest Department?
So you're writing to the principal chief conservator of forest, wildlife, and biodiversity. So there are many, even in the forest department, there are various divisions. So you have social forestry, you have CAMPA, you have wildlife and biodiversity, and so on. And there usually will be a PCCF for each of these divisions in the state. You are applying to the principal chief conservator of forest, wildlife and biodiversity. That's the authority that you're applying to, not to the DFO of any particular location. When the permission is granted, if and when the permission is granted, then the permission is granted by the office of the PCCA Wildlife and Biodiversity. And then you have to go to whichever DFO of the concerned division that you're working in, inform them that this permission has been granted, take their assent, and then go into the, just because the PCF has granted permission doesn't mean that you can enter without informing the local authorities. So the range forest officer and the divisional forest officer have to know that you are in that park, in that wildlife sanctuary doing this research, because uh, they are responsible for what happens in there, right? If somebody goes in and is conducting research without them knowing, then that's an offense. That's an offense under the Wildlife Protection Act.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and many states, also have like a research advisory body. So when proposals are sent to the state for permission, they review the proposal, and often we are called to give a presentation on our proposal, and we also receive comments and suggestions. Sometimes maybe you might put a proposal for ringing 80 birds, and they'll try to they'll ask you to rationalize the number even more, especially if it's a threatened species. They might ask you, can't you work with 20? So these kind of changes are also at times we have to accommodate based on like comments and suggestions from this committee in certain states. Yeah.
Mosby, I think you have some questions for you in the chat box.
Okay, what is the difference between the dispersal of male and female birds from nest? I really uh, don't have an idea about this. Umesh, would you like to take it?
Um, we don't have information from India
Yeah.
about this, but in the Amazon, some people have said that unlike mammals, where the females stay in the territory of the parents and the males disperse, it's the other way around in birds, at least in the Amazon, where the females disperse to new territories preferentially, and the males uh, stay back in the territory. But we don't know if that's applicable to where we are, because Amazonian birds are quite special. They're quite different from our bird populations. For example, Amazonian birds, there are a lot of what are called transients, or floating individuals that don't have territories. Very rarely do we see that happening in the old world, which is Africa and Asia and Australia. So, as far as we know, probably female birds are the ones that are leaving the territories and establishing new territories somewhere else. Or rather, not establishing new territories, but pairing up with males that have established territories somewhere else.
Okay, so the next question would
Sir.
be okay. Yeah, Govind.
Sir, yes, sorry to interrupt. I was just wondering if males don't disperse in farm territories at all, and they just take up the ones of their parents. If they do disperse at a later point of time.
Do they what, sorry? Can you repeat that? If the
If
males stay
do
in,
males if the males stay in their parents' territory for a greater amount of time, or do they eventually disperse at a later date?
I don't know. I don't know with forest passerines. I don't. Um, so I would imagine this depends on a whole lot of factors. So, for example, cooperative breeding is quite a common breeding strategy for birds. In I'm familiar with Himalayan birds, so a lot of babblers have cooperative breeding, where the offspring of one generation uh, helps the parents in raising the offspring of the next generation. And so you've got these family groups, and that might be because there are no territories available to disperse to, and you'd rather indirectly enhance your fitness by raising your brothers and sisters, rather than going trying to find another territory which you might not end up in. So strategies for males in those kinds of bird species might be very different from strategies in males that are non don't have cooperative breeding. So the short answer is I don't know. But the long answer is that it probably depends on what kind of species we're talking about.
So according to Amazonian birds, at least, cooperative breeding is more common in males than females.
Cooperative breeding is more common here than it is in the Amazon.
I see. Okay, sir. You also mentioned transient species. What does that mean again, sir?
Sorry, I can't hear you very clearly. You mentioned, can you repeat that, please, Govind? You're muted. Transient species, transient individuals. So a species itself would not be transient, but in the population of the species there would be transient individuals. But there are far more transients in Amazonian bird populations than there are in old world bird populations. Moshumi, is that question to you and a mixed population of birds in the chat box?
I, I'm not sure. Excuse me.
Hello.
So, Shravan, when you say stratified method of nesting, yeah,
So I was reading an article like found this thing. So couldn't able to understand like how if we say like a bird occupy an area in a canopy, do we consider the total nesting tree canopy? Like I even don't know, like is it a uh, good place to discuss or like
no, no, no. I mean, you mean if you have a tree and it's got a canopy, then and you have multiple
mm,
birds nesting in the canopy,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So
and
What do you
what
want
is
to
it that you're
understand?
trying to measure?
Yeah.
sorry.
What are you trying to understand?
So when we say that percent area occupied by the species, like if a certain species occupy the top canopy, and if another bird occupies it in the periphery of the canopy,
Okay.
so like
Okay.
how
So
do you consider the yeah?
okay. So like for instance, if you want to know occupancy, I think like how much of the tree is occupied, I think there's just the number of nests would give you a decent idea, a relative use kind of thing. But if, say for instance, if your question is if a certain species prefers a certain part of the canopy, then you might want to take certain measurements. Like for instance, you might want to look at height of different nests of a particular species and look at the distribution of heights for each species that you find on the tree and see if there is some vertical segregation across species. Similarly, you can do it along the horizontal axis, like from the interior of the canopy to the periphery. uh,
Okay.
you can take measurements about on individual nests of every species and look at the spread of that to see if actually there is any segregation between species or not.
And
Look at the spread of the data. Yeah.
okay, so do we have an equipments or devices to measure uh, like to reach up the nests, or do we have to do it as a physically?
So you can estimate height, no, using clinometer. Yeah, so
Okay,
there are these simple
kilometers, yeah.
handheld devices that you can use to measure height from the ground itself. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I read it some 80s paper, so they physically climbed the tree, and so yeah. So
Sure.
in a these days, like those activities are restricted, right? So
Yeah, most often you don't need to climb the tree.
yeah, yeah. So thank you.
If I could just add to that, Shravan, you can have species that nest in parts of the canopy, but forage somewhere else completely. So the use of the canopy in terms of foraging might be very different from the use of the canopy in terms of nesting. Uh, and one of the classic papers on this is by Robert MacArthur on 5 species of very similar warblers that inhabit these coniferous forests, breed in these coniferous forests in North America. And he showed that these in the same tree, different species forage in different parts of the canopy. Some towards the interior, some towards the exterior, some towards the top, some towards the bottom part of it. So that's an interesting paper. I just type MacArthur. If you just look for MacArthur warblers, you'll find not only the paper itself, but also a whole lot of other commentary and work that's been done on it. So, Govind, this question is, could transient be
Thank
similar
you.
to nomadic? So, you have species that might be nomadic, like pelagic open ocean birds, like albatrosses or petrels, that don't have very well-defined home ranges. So the population so all the individuals in the population as a whole might be nomadic. You know, and the reason for that nomadism is probably because the resources that they feed on are patchily distributed, and you find that resource here today, and it will finish here, and you have to move somewhere else to find the resources that you're feeding on. So uh, species that rely on patchy resources. These are birds like pelagic open ocean birds, frugivores, birds that eat fruits. Uh, because one tree is fruiting here today, and then the fruit is all consumed, and then the next fruiting tree is somewhere else in the habitat. So they tend to move quite a bit and not have well-defined territories. When we say transient, we're talking about individuals in the population. So it's not at the species level. So you've got species where the population is partly made up of, or largely made up of, male and female pair that holds a territory and defends a territory. But then there are other individuals in the population that have not yet been able to find a vacant territory. And so they are moving through the habitat looking for a vacant territory that they can take over. And so those are transient individuals. So the distinction between species and individuals is what
I have a question related to the population distribution and sometimes the effect of other factors on it. So two things. So one example that you gave, Mr. Umesh, uh, in your lecture was about the jaguar population getting disturbed around the Panama Canal construction or something, right? So, uh, one part of the question is related to that, meaning the jaguar population from that area has reduced to something. So, it must have been redistributed to other regions, right?
So that particular case is a result of fragmentation, what's called habitat fragmentation. So you have the Panama Canal being built, and when the Panama Canal is built, you have all this water coming into the and inundating low-lying forest, and you're left with one island in the middle of the forest. It's a fragment of forest, and that's called Barra Colorado Island. Now, Barra Colorado Island itself is the jaguars could have dispersed, but it lacks jaguars, and that's because the area of the island is not enough to support a minimum viable population of jaguars. Whether those jaguars tried to persist in Barra Colorado Island and then died out, or whether they dispersed to other areas, yeah, it could be either of those two.
Okay. And this, okay, so it means that it depends on the species and the availability of resources again in the surrounding regions or something. The second question
Uh,
is, okay, go ahead. You had to add something.
no, yes, it depends on. If you have a size of a fragment of forest, and it's 20 square kilometers, and each individual requires of a species requires 1 square kilometer. So then there are going to be 20 individuals in that forest patch. Now, if 20 individuals is enough for that population to persist, it will persist. If the minimum viable population size is excuse me, is 20, then that population will persist. If the minimum viable, if the area occupied by every individual is 2 square kilometers, then you're only going to have 10 individuals on that in that fragment. And area will so minimum population is 20. You only have 10. That population will then go locally extinct from that fragment. So it depends on the species, and so in fragments you'll typically find more small species because they have smaller range sizes. But large species tend to disappear from these forest fragments.
Okay, so there is a concept of this local extinction. I mean, local extinction versus the global kind of thing also. Okay. Second part of question is related to again population density. Is I have this thought about the migration of birds, right? I mean, the migratory birds have a certain area for breeding grounds, and then they go to other regions for wintering and all this thing. What if due to anthropological reason or the calamity or the accident natural reason, if that their home ground itself is destroyed, what happens in such cases? I mean, are there any examples on that, or the how does the ecology work in that case? Can you elaborate
There
on that?
are there are examples of this, and it's not only the breeding grounds and the wintering grounds. It's also what are called stopover sites. So with waders across the world, with the well-known species like the great knot and the red knot, and all these other waders, they breed high up in the Arctic, in the tundra, in summer, and then they come down. They migrate down to New Zealand, Northern Australia, Southeast Asia, and so on. But while they're migrating, they have to stop over at locations to refuel, to be able to get energy enough to continue their migration. Now, the stopover sites are largely around the Yellow Sea, Korea, China, that area. Now, where they're feeding is what are called intertidal mudflats. So you've got these long beaches of mud, and you have these mollusks and stuff inside those under in the mud, and these birds come to these intertidal mudflats, stay for 3 days, feed at very high rates, gain more energy, and then continue. But what's happening is that the intertidal mudflats are being developed because they're overlooking the sea, and so a lot of buildings. The area of the intertidal mudflat is coming down, and that is causing reductions in the populations of these migratory species. So if you lose breeding, if you lose uh, either breeding grounds or stopover sites or wintering grounds, it will cause a decline in the populations of species. Another example is Kirtland's warbler, that is from, I'll just type that into the chat box. Kirtland's warbler is a North American species that breeds only in young jack pine. It's got a very specific habitat, and that habitat is maintained by fire. And when it burns, then that's the habitat that's created for that the Kirtland warbler breeds in. Because people had been suppressing fire, for managers had been saying no, stop fires from happening here. That habitat slowly started disappearing. Kirtland's warbler populations also came down. But then managers have now started burning that habitat, and fire is a part of that ecosystem. That habitat burns even naturally. Um, and the Kirtland warblers populations are coming back up.
Oh, that's interesting. Thanks.
Tanu Sangwan has raised a hand. Are you muted by any chance? We can't hear you.
Tanu, can you unmute yourself?
Excuse me, sir.
We heard you briefly there, but you're back on mute.
Please ask your question.
Sir, I wanted to know about niche specialization. There is a overlap sharing between two species.
Niche specialization. So every species has a niche, right? What exactly is the question now? You have got two species with two niches, right? So you've got a species that specializes, let's say, on figs, and you've got another species that eats other fruits from other trees. So what, or you can have species that share niches, or share parts of their niches. For example, if you go to a location, and the niche has many dimensions, right? Your niche can be determined by what temperatures you like, what humidity the species is adapted to, what it eats, what its predators are. All of that comes together to make the niche. So you can have two species at the same location that share the abiotic niche. They're sharing the niche of temperature and precipitation and rainfall and humidity and so on. But they might be very different in their food niche. One species might be eating a certain type of prey item, another species might be eating a completely different type of prey item. So they're able to coexist in that location because of the specialization of their niches on the dietary axis, but they're still sharing aspects of the niche in terms of temperature and rainfall.
Okay. So is it open to ask a question right now? Umesh, this question is for you. Uh, let's leave how migration happens aside. There are a lot of studies with endocrinology and how the neurosystem and endocrine system work together to, let's leave that aside. In the last 20, 30 years ago, we didn't know the exact routes. Now we even know the exact routes, how birds migrate. What routes do they take? Where are the corridors? How do they arrive at their wintering grounds and breeding grounds? If we leave these two questions aside, what would you say are the two or the five most pressing questions regarding migration that we need to answer, that are in front of science right now? What are the most important questions that we need to answer? What are the most pressing questions we have right now? Let's leave how migration happens and the paths aside. Yeah.
I don't really study migration at all. I'm more of like I study bird communities, and I study like bird population dynamics. So I'm not familiar with the migration stuff. But I think one I can point to one key question that we really need to understand is timings of migration have evolved to coincide with timings of resource availability. So birds have, so if I start migrating in June, or let's say I start migrating in April, then I want to reach my wintering grounds. Or let's put it this way. Now, I'm wintering in some location and I have to go back to my breeding grounds. I time my migration such that I reach my breeding grounds, lay eggs, and the chicks are hatched when the availability of the resources, let's say caterpillars, is highest. So the birds have timed their migratory timings to coincide with when the resources are most abundant. That's when the chicks are also there to be fed. Often, what happens is what are called phenological mismatches. So birds might have evolved to use day length as a method of as a cue to migrate, whereas their prey like caterpillars are using temperature as a cue to migrate. So day length is not changing, so the birds are migrating at the same time, but caterpillars are emerging earlier in the year because the temperatures are warmer, and so you have this mismatch which, when you have the maximum number of chicks with the most mouths to feed 20, 30 years back, that's when there would be maximum caterpillars also in the habitat. Today, when you've got maximum number of chicks in the habitat to feed, caterpillar biomass has already peaked because they've emerged earlier. So I think one of the things to understand is how these physiological mismatches are actually affecting populations and fitness, and whether these are going to be whether this is going to be a problem in terms of just the populations of these migratory species being able to persist. But I think I can think more. I'm sure Moshmi here. Moshmi,
Yeah, I think related to what Umesh said, we are also observing declines in many of these migratory species populations and trying to figure out the reasons behind it. If it is because of this kind of decoupling that might be happening between their breeding initiation and when the food is available, I think understanding these is definitely very, very important at this junction. Yeah.
so Harini has a follow-up question asking whether does that mean butterfly populations are going up? No. In fact, lepidopteran populations have crashed quite significantly, and that's for a variety of reasons, the use of pesticides and so on. What's actually happening here is butterflies go out and lay eggs, and the hatching of those eggs is now earlier in the year rather than later in the year, because the hatching of the eggs is determined by temperature. And because temperatures are becoming warmer and warmer, if let's say the egg hatches at 20 degrees Celsius, right? Earlier 20 degrees Celsius might have been on 15th May in that habitat. Today the habitat reaches 20 degrees Celsius on the 1st of May. So the eggs are hatching on the 1st of May instead of the 15th of May. So that's what's happening with climate change, which is the eggs are hatching earlier. It's not that the populations are going up, it's just the timing is changing.
Mostly just based on the answer that you gave,
Yeah.
so the population, the species is declining.
Yeah.
We're observing that. Now, say you're studying Gajalurba Lake in West Bengal,
Mm-hmm.
and year on year you have recorded pin-tailed ducks and not pin-tailed ducks, let's say greater scops and golden eyes and other forms of Anatidae species. Now, supposing the year that you're framing this question, that I want to record what rare species of ducks come in West Bengal and is their population declining or not. And in
Mm-hmm.
that particular winter, the ducks do not arrive in Gajaldorba Lake. Instead, they go and arrive in some dam in Jharkhand.
Mm-hmm.
So, what happens to your study and your question? Do you still report that this year we did not observe, but we cannot draw any broad conclusions because we do not know where else the birds have arrived? Or do you go to eBird and then take a broader data set of how many species arrived in new locations that were the species of my interest, and then
Yeah,
translate it?
so
What
yeah,
happens to the study? What happens to
yeah,
that question that you had initially, and then how do you evolve your
yeah.
research?
So like some of us are also involved in analysis of all this eBird data. You must have seen the State of India's Bird report that we. One report came out, and now we are working on the second report. And often, when we are trying to understand how populations are performing, site-specific data is not very informative. Like for instance, what happens is
But the collective site specific
yeah,
data is informative, right? All
yeah,
the
yeah,
site
exactly.
specific data put together is important.
Exactly. So what you talked about is exactly the reason why data from one site doesn't give us the full picture about how a population might be performing, and as you said, like when we collectively put together information from larger data sets like eBird, that is often very much more useful to look at large scale trends in species populations. Another challenge that we often face, especially now we are doing this exercise. So what happens is you might be seeing a species showing a decline based on the countrywide data, but when we have looked at some of our individual studies where we have looked at one that same species in one site, we don't see much changing, and that is often because that species is actually experiencing a wide range of conditions across its range. Maybe much of it is getting modified, lost to urbanization, deforested, degraded, but often we study in a very specific location. Most of us end up studying in protected areas which are not changing at the same rate as the rest of the species range. So it is often difficult to capture what is happening to the species overall from these single site studies. Although, if you want to pin down mechanisms like what is happening, if something is going through a decline, then what exactly is causing mortality, or maybe they're not breeding properly. Those kind of studies have to be designed in specific sites, and if you want to really understand what's happening, most probably you have to make a very judicious selection of sites, which kind of captures all the kind of conditions that species experiences across its range. Umesh, anything you would like to add? I
Right.
think we are also towards the end. Yeah.
You answered that question. Just one more follow-up question on that.
Yeah.
Supposing you were doing a large-scale study and you
Mm.
needed data from a broad region, just not one site.
Yeah.
How does one approach eBird to get that kind of data?
Actually, approaching eBird is very very easy. They have a data request form, so you just have to put in your request and mention how you want to use this data, what purpose you want to put this data, use this data for, and they just make the data available to you. Often the difficulty with handling eBird data is the volume is extremely high. So you have to be very yeah. So just the computational power that you require to use that and use it in a sensible way requires a lot of skill as well as computational power. Yeah.
I think, yeah, we should, we can wrap up now, I guess. We can take this one question from Avana Bera, and then we can wrap it up. Is it okay with Umesh, Musmi?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, well, they're going to cover that in any case in the population estimation section. So there will be one session dedicated to
Okay,
the various methods that are used to estimate population. So that will be covered in that.
okay then. Yeah,
I think
I think,
for the remaining questions, I would request the learners to just post them on the discussion board, and we try our best to answer them there.
yeah, I think, yeah,
Thank
we
you.
can wrap up the session for today. Thank you, Umesh, and thank you, Musmi.
Yeah. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you all.